Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of the Napkin Notes podcast. I'm your host, Elizabeth Evans, and today we have a bit of a unique episode for you because I have on my personal therapist, Laura Williams. Laura is a certified professional counselor and also hosts her own podcast, Encountering You, on the K-Love podcast network known as Access More. I put on my Instagram stories a couple of weeks ago asking you guys about your effects or exposure at all to bullying in high school. I was surprised that over 50% of people said that they experienced it, and over 50% said they still had lasting effects from that. And so I share in this episode a little bit of my personal story with that. Which felt vulnerable, but it also felt necessary just because of how many other people have experienced that too, and basically how we can overcome that. I may even have on my mom at some point in time to hear her perspective on it because she and my dad both were such advocates for me during that time period. So it would be actually interesting to hear a mother's perspective on that. So in this conversation, I opened up with what my definition of counseling is, the effects of high school bullying, the root cause behind our people-pleasing tendencies, steps to change that, and in a digital world, how to handle negative comments and just criticism, whether it is kindly intended or not. I love this conversation because there are points of it where it feels like a personal counseling session, and I'm really excited for maybe people that haven't experienced counseling before to get a taste of that today. I've been in and out of counseling since I think pretty much the age of 18. I don't know what got me started in it in the first place, but I'm so grateful that I have had wonderful counselors in my life. And I think Laura is probably my longest run with a counselor at this point in time. But I also want to mention, just because I'm so proud of her, Laura is founding a nonprofit which is going to allow accessibility of high quality counseling at a price that's a little bit more accessible and affordable, while also not decreasing the quality of pay for these counselors as well. So she has been able to really create this new essentially business model of this nonprofit, again, to make high-end counseling more accessible and affordable, while also not compromising on the value of what these counselors really deserve to be paid for their services in the first place. So you guys, I hope that you love this conversation as much as I do. If you have not been in therapy before, don't let that stop you from tuning in, because I think that this might present a new way for you to view it. Here is my conversation with Laura Williams. Laura, thank you for being on Napkin Notes today. You are in Cleveland, Tennessee for your son that attends Lee University.
Yes.
Because you have 3 boys.
Yes,
You're
I
such
do.
a boy mom.
I know, and I love it.
Which son is it that you're going to play? The middle son? Or is this the oldest?
So this is my oldest. He's a senior at Lee University, and all 3 of my boys are really good baseball players. And, this is one that when he was, 7 years old, I used to be a professional dream crusher, and he's always wanted to play professional baseball, and he's really close. Like, it's really fun. So, yeah.
Wait, you said you used to be a professional dream crusher?
Yes. So I would, I was just one of those realistic people that was like, I get that you really want to do that, but there's only 2% of people that actually get to do these things and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, he's 7. He doesn't care about stats. All he cares about that his favorite baseball player is up on screen, and that's what he wants to do for the rest of his life. And so through a lot of counseling, I figured out that I'm like, I don't have to crush their dreams. Like, there's plenty of time for real life to hit them in the face. So let them dream. Let them do what they want to do while they can.
Dream.
So, yeah.
I love that. Part of the premise of Napkin Notes is sometimes in adulthood, it takes going back to our childhood to figure out what we want and how to dream again. Because you're right, the world will kind of tell us who to be and what to do. And we need the people around us that will help us dream. I always tell people around me when I'm just kind of ideating or dreaming or throwing stuff out there, please don't blow holes in my idea, because I have already torn it apart before I'm even speaking it out to somebody.
Yes.
I don't need somebody else to tear it down.
No.
because I'm still in a fragile dreaming state. So I have tried to be better about who and when I speak a dream out to,
Mhm.
because it's still so fragile. And I don't want to put them in also a bad spot if they want to say something. I don't want to be too fragile to take it to heart. So I think
Yeah.
it is really important to let them dream.
It is. It
Ah.
is. It is. It's really fun. So,
Well, Laura, you are my personal therapist. Is that okay to say? Am I allowed to? I'm allowed to say
yes.
that. You're not
Yeah,
allowed to
you're
say
allowed
that,
to say
right?
whatever you want.
Okay. Laura is my personal therapist. If you ask her on the street, she cannot confirm nor can she deny, but I'm confirming it
Nope.
here. She and I think we met back, was it 2020 when we started working together?
I feel like it's been a while because it was back
Okay.
in the little house.
Yes. Because
Yeah.
I actually think our first session was via Zoom. That's the
You
only
yes.
reason that I think it
Yep,
might be
you're
back
right.
to 2020.
You're right.
So you do a discovery call first. So we hopped on the phone. I think it was like a quick 10 or 15 minute just to kind of get
Mhm.
to know each other. I remember
Yeah.
exactly where I was in that moment, which is kind of a funny story, but I didn't realize that that was sort of a pendulum moment in my life that I feel
Mhm.
like you've helped me change my life for the better in so many different
Oh,
aspects. So
good.
thank you for being along for the ride. And you've seen a lot of different things, a lot of
Mhm.
different life seasons, a lot of different milestones. And what I tell people with counseling and with therapy is, in that counseling room, you get to practice who to be outside of that counseling room.
Yes.
Because there are things that I tell you first, or things that I have only told you, and there is no judgment. There is support and encouragement, and it allows me to show up. It's the most overused word, but as my authentic, transparent, vulnerable self. And
Mhm.
I get to practice that with you.
Mhm.
And then I get to go out into the real world outside of those four walls and see who I can be safe enough around to act like that as well. So, any kind of, whether it's approval seeking behavior or people pleasing behavior, I get to practice not being that with you and then
Mhm.
test it out in the real world. So, I always tell people it doesn't take a big level of trauma to need therapy or
No.
to need counseling, but you
Mm-mm.
get to have a sandbox environment of who you want to be outside of those four walls. And so, I feel like you have helped me settle in to a more true version of myself. So
Yeah.
thank you for the work that you do.
Well, it's an honor. And I've been reading this book called The Way of Integrity. It's an amazing book. Oh my gosh, it's so good. And yeah, it's amazing, Martha Beck. And she talks about that each of us, me included, right? All of us have people in our lives. And she calls them soul teachers.
Hmm.
And I just love that term. And she talks about how we each have a soul teacher inside of us, but we also need soul teachers on the outside of us to kind of help us. Right. And so when she said that, I thought, oh, that's kind of what I am and what I want to be. Right. Like, and I have my own soul teachers in my life too. Right. And so it's a really neat, um, I don't know, it's a privilege to get to be in that role for people and to really kind of get to see what you don't show everybody else. I mean, I think that's a really um I consider that sacred space. So, yeah, I'm
Yeah.
excited. I love being in that space with you. It's really is an honor. So,
Thanks. Sometimes that
mhm.
space is in person. Sometimes I've had to take calls from my car.
Yep.
Sometimes that space is fluid. Um,
Yep.
but it is interesting because it's scary showing those
Mhm.
parts to people as well.
Yeah.
And it's interesting also what shows up. You and I have done small bouts of EMDR before.
Mhm.
And it's just interesting to see what version of emotions kind of show up.
Mhm. Yes.
And so not knowing what can happen on the other side of that, of like what you're going to feel, can be scary. But knowing that there is somebody walking that through with you is what allows myself to feel a bit more settled. You said that you love being in that space with people.
Mhm.
Did you always know that you wanted to be a counselor or a therapist growing up?
No, I didn't. I would say that once I got into college, I was feeling that. But here's what I will tell you. It's really interesting when I think back to childhood. One of the things I always say, like when I'm working with somebody, especially on family of origin stuff, we'll say, if that's something that they're coming in for. Um, when we look at family of origin, I always look at parents with like the kindness, like with a lot of kindness and respect because they're doing a big job, right? And a lot of them did not get the tools that they needed. So when they come into raising kids, a lot of times they're well meaning, right? They really are.
Yes.
And so what I always go back to is even amidst when my dad would, rage and when he would leave or whatever he would do, right? The things that have caused me some of the more traumatic things in my life. Um, he used to sit with me at the dinner table and we would talk through life, right? Like, and where the angle was always going was, I wonder why humanity is the way it is, right?
Mm.
Like, I wonder why. He was so curious. And so that's something that I've always been interested in, right? Like I wouldn't have called it counseling at that point, but understanding why people do what they do and helping them have agency, right? Like helping them find the space to have a choice is like, I think something that my dad and I shared in common. And it was something that was always on his heart. Now he never really got a chance to do any of that. He was a service technician for Sears for his whole life, but his brain was wired like that. And so, very early on, I was always asking the questions, why? Like, why did somebody do what they do?
Yeah.
So, and then I got to college and then was supposed to be a pre-med biology major and quickly found out that that was not for me. I did not want to dissect things and I didn't like a lot of blood and all those things. And I was like, nope, this is not for me. And so
And
then I
yet you're
took my
still a boy
first,
mom.
yeah, yep, yep. They know not to come to me with a loose tooth, but
That's good. That's good. We
I'm
all have
like,
our strengths and
yeah,
weaknesses.
listen, I draw my line at anything that has to do with
Blood
teeth or
dissecting.
saliva and blood.
Okay.
Yeah.
Teeth, saliva, and blood. If I'm
Yep.
in an emergency, Laura, good thing that you're not my emergency contact.
I know.
Emotional emergency contact for sure. Physical,
Yes.
we'll call
I'll
somebody
do
else.
emotions. Nothing like that scares me. Teeth. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a big
Nope.
one.
So you feel like there was those conversations with your dad that sort of instilled this curiosity about
Yeah.
humanity, why things are the
Mhm.
way that they are. So
Yeah.
I can see how that might turn into the pre-med biology thing of why things are made up the way that they are. You just
Mhm.
shifted that into a more
Yeah.
non-physical realm.
Yeah. Yeah. I think also I was in a phase of like, talk about angsty teenager, right? I would get annoyed. I'm like, Dad, things are just the way they are, So even though I was interested in it, I was kind of being a little, what do you want to say it? I don't even say like oppositional, but it was just kind of like, I'm going to do something different,
Yeah.
So I think that was more about what that was. And then I was like, okay, well, here we are again. Why people do
Yeah.
what they do.
Yeah. I don't know if you're
So
comfortable answering this, but would you say that your dad was not necessarily like a dreamer? I don't want to call him like a dream crusher, but it sounds like that was something that was a pattern in your life. Was that something that was that you witnessed growing up too?
actually, no, it's really fascinating.
Interesting.
My dad, again, like, the both and, right? My dad was very much a dreamer. In fact, like
Wow.
the song we played at his funeral was called it was Imagine by John Lennon. It's
Yeah.
one of the most beautiful songs, but it's a dreamer song. Like it's
Wow.
that's how he was. I've found a lot of his writings since he died. He died about 14 years ago. And it's really neat to read just everything. He was so creative and he really was a dreamer, to be honest. And I never ever felt like that's one thing that my dad, he was born in New England. So, there was not this idea that women can't do this and men are built for this. It was very much like, nope, you can do anything you want. So,
Wow.
yeah, I don't know where my dream crushing came in, but he was definitely not one. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
good. We love a
Yeah.
supportive dad. And that sounds nice that you're able to then recorrect from things that maybe you did previously in your parenting. And now
Yeah.
that you're changing that at least
Absolutely.
like thing that you are subscribing to.
Yeah.
Um, which I think is also just helpful for people to know that patterns can change, becoming aware of them first, but you
Hmm.
can become a different version of that. Um, Mostly through counseling, in my opinion. Um,
Yes.
But was there a time in your life where you stopped pursuing counseling and then came back to it? Is that right?
Yes. So after I graduated with my master's, I got pregnant with my first was when I was starting my master's program, that I was pregnant with my second when I was graduating. And so at that time, I was doing an internship at a sexual trauma center in Orlando,
Wow.
Florida.
Okay.
And we worked primarily with children. And so, to be honest, I got really burnt out because I was
That's
going to
heavy.
be, yeah, it was a lot of heavy work. And so I really thought that I was going to work in that field. And um, so I thought to myself, there's no way I can do this with little kids. I really couldn't. And to be honest, I really do feel like it was God kind of closing that door for a while because I was also not healthy enough emotionally to be able to work with people. I tell this to people all the time. I loved this theory called reality therapy. And basically it was like, get a grip on yourself, deal with your life and move on. Like that was my approach to therapy. And clearly that's not effective because if it worked, we wouldn't need counselors. So,
That's so funny because that is
yeah,
the complete opposite of how I experience our sessions now. Like I would have
exactly.
never have guessed that. And I've had
Right.
counselors that have given me more of that tough love, a little bit more advice, a little bit more, what are you doing? Kind of, let
Hmm.
me just shake it out of you. And I can see how that helped me to a point, but it was when
Yeah.
you and I started doing work together. I came in a little bit of a crisis mode, but it was when I continued to go when I was not in a crisis and I didn't have a huge life decision to make that I
Hmm.
felt like my personality really started to transform and my internal mindset started to really transform because I wasn't fixing a problem in my life. I was actually doing kind of a complete emotional overhaul.
Yes.
But
Yes.
it
And I
took, I
love how you
think,
say that.
yeah, but if you had just told me like, oh, leave that relationship, and then I would have thought, oh, I'm fixed.
Hmm.
But while I ultimately did leave that relationship, there was still so much more to unpack. And I'm just so glad that I was able to maintain that relationship with you because much like you of how you feel like maybe a different person, especially a different counselor since then,
Hmm.
I look back on that version of my life even 5 or 6 years ago and I think I almost don't know her. And
Right.
it wasn't that I look back and dislike that version of me. I am still so proud of what she accomplished, what she did, how she changed. But my thoughts now are not those thoughts that I was having back
Mm-mm.
then.
No, it's fascinating because it is, I think a lot of times people think behavior change is what we need, and it's not. It's heart change, right? It is internal. It's a sense of self that has to change in order for the behaviors to change. So even if, I mean, even taking the example of a relationship, right? Like, sure, it would be easy to follow instructions, okay, and just do what somebody tells you to do. But there's a reason why you're having trouble doing that, right? There's a reason why you didn't internally know this isn't right for me, right? And so it's looking at, okay, why was that decision so difficult, right? And understanding the why, which is, that's my question. I'm always curious, like what's going on there, right? Why is that so difficult? Boundaries are easy, right? Everybody knows what the right boundaries are. It's the why. Why do I have difficulty setting them is the problem, right? It's I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint somebody, or I'm afraid somebody's going to be mad at me, or I'm afraid I'm going to be seen as lazy or whatever it is, right? I mean, that's the internal stuff that we have to do. It's easy to just tell somebody what to do, right? Yeah.
Yeah, something that you taught me as well was once I was able to start to access the feeling of anger,
Hmm.
actually was very healing because it's anger is not a bad emotion. You taught me that it identified when somebody crossed a boundary.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
that was something that was interesting to me because I was trying to figure out why did I never, I always prided myself so much in being even Steven and never having to say words I didn't mean, to take them back and really thoughtful responses to things, even heated discussions. And I realized, oh, it's because anger is so hard for me to access because I thought it was bad. But realizing
Right.
anger, righteous justice, and like it was easy for me to step up for other people, but for myself, it never was. And so
Right.
I think that's where I knew, like you said, from a knowledge perspective, boundaries
Mhm.
obviously important.
Right.
But you really taught me that tough boundaries, or at least hard boundaries, like knowing what they are, remain a soft heart.
Yes.
And
Yep.
so when I didn't feel like I was people pleasing all the time, and then I felt like my internal people were just kind of getting the crumbs of what was left of me because I
Yep.
didn't have boundaries with whether it was business or clients. And then by the end of the day, I just had nothing left. And so I just
Right.
realized like, oh, I was losing parts of myself that I wanted back. And then we kind of dove into why was I behaving this way in the first place. So,
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Yep.
and speaking of that, I would love to talk a little bit about, I put this on my Instagram stories the other day, a little bit about the adulthood effects of bullying, specifically on
Mhm.
women in high
Yeah.
school.
Yeah.
So this came up in a conversation with now what call like season 1 of the podcast with Allie Cyrus.
Yeah.
And she brought up how she played small, that she changed her personality, that she
Mhm.
became adaptable after she was so harshly bullied in high school
Yeah.
because she was just fearful of the outcome of if she didn't do that. And that sparked an idea in me of I know that I had a very unique experience that happened to me in high school. How many other women are experiencing this too?
Mhm.
So I put a poll up on my Instagram, and it was a little over half said that they have experienced or they did experience bullying in high school, and a little bit over half that said it still affected them today.
Really?
I think that that's low. I bet there's a
Mhm.
lot more people out there that experience it. But I will
Mhm.
tell you, 9 times out of 10, when I was having the internal or the in person conversation with a friend saying, did you experience high school bullying? They almost always said, yeah, but it was just the normal kind.
Right.
And something you said was really insightful to me. You said we need to not normalize this behavior in
Mhm.
any setting, especially high
Right.
school, but in any setting. And
Yes.
I thought that was so insightful because I think that number would be higher on my Instagram poll if people actually identified it as not just normal bullying and then wiping it away as if it never happened. What I would love in this conversation is if we're able to unpack how we cannot overly normalize that and then start to kind of identify what the characteristics look like in adulthood when we still are under that mindset of people may not receive well my thoughts or just my presence or my behavior because I feel like that's really what bullying is in high school.
Mhm.
um, I just don't want adults walking around with unhealed wounds from
Yes.
15, 20 years ago.
Yes.
um, I'll share a little bit of my story, and I want to share it because I know it's not just mine. Like I want to put kind of a story and a voice to what people have experienced. But
Mhm.
when I was in high school, it was a little bit of an extreme situation. It's not something that I share often, but it was my junior year of high school, and I ended up receiving written on the bathroom walls death threats.
Mhm.
And when the principal initially called me in and said that something was written about me in the bathroom, I thought, because normalized bullying, I was like, girls are being girls. Somebody probably wrote something mean. We can take care of it. When the police were brought in, when the police dogs were brought in, when they caution taped off the bathroom, this is when I was realizing this was far bigger than
Mhm.
anything that I could have ever anticipated. Um, and that was really hard for me at that time because the principal was then reaching out to other girls in the school to try to figure out who did it. So it
Yeah.
wasn't just the bullying at school. Then, of course, it was AIM that after school, people thought I was giving up names, which I absolutely, I had every right to, but I didn't. I had no
Yeah.
idea who had written that, where it had come from, or who in the world I even had a problem with. And so,
Right.
um, later on in the year, they couldn't figure out who had done it. And
Mhm.
the principal and the vice principal came to the conclusion that I wrote them this about myself for attention reasons.
Wow.
And in my 16-year-old self, I remember that was the first time thinking, you cannot always trust people in authority.
Mhm.
I wasn't protected at school. I wasn't
Yep.
protected out of school. And I
Mhm.
wasn't protected from what the authorities, what they should have taken, the action they should have taken.
Right.
And I just remember thinking, how am I supposed to protect myself in this situation? And Laura, I don't think I've stopped thinking that since.
Mhm. Yeah.
What can we do? Because I've been in counseling for 18 years, but every time I talk about this, it still makes me emotional. And when I ask other women about their experience with bullying, they still get emotional.
Yeah.
This particular thing didn't have a face to it. Like, I didn't know who had done this. I didn't find out till years later. And so it just felt like this faceless piece of, I'll call it little T trauma that just followed me for a while. And I've been
Mhm.
in counseling for a long time, but it still makes me emotional.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why, years later, even after therapy and counseling, does this make me emotional?
Right. Well, I mean, I think one of the things that I always talk about, and I think, you can appreciate this, and many people do, because a lot of people, there's a lot of there's a lot of information out there about inner child work and going back and healing those young wounds, right? But when we think about a little kid experiencing this, right? And even at 16, you're just a little kid. You really are still a kid. Um, it makes us emotional because it's just a kid, right? Like, it's hard. And it doesn't necessarily, if we get emotional about it, it doesn't mean that it's still raw or it's still wide open, even though we might have the effects of it.
Mhm.
A lot of the work that I do with clients is that inner child work, right? So when we think about a 16-year-old, especially after you've done this work, okay, it is easy to access those emotions about her, right? Because she was vulnerable and she did need people to protect her. And the people in authority didn't, right? Now, thankfully, you had your parents that stood up and advocated for you, right?
Yeah, they did.
Which a lot of times makes the difference is when parents can step in and help out, right? Um, but there is a part of you now that's like, hmm, do I really trust them? Right? Not your parents, but authority figures,
Yeah,
right? And so it is one of those things that when it does come up in the present, you've got to kind of sit with it and understand, right? Like, okay, is that true? Can I not, can I truly not trust authority figures? Does that make sense? But the emotion of it is that you're connected to it. You're connected to that little girl that experienced that. And that's not abnormal, right? That part is okay. It's the hypervigilance, right? When we go out and we're constantly like looking to make sure I'm safe, or looking to make sure that there's no danger around, right? Or not trusting um, relationships, either in our adult life and personally or professionally, right? Like those are the areas that we really see it and the
Mhm.
effects of it. Um, so that does that make sense how I'm talking about that? Like, we can be emotional about it because we're
Absolutely.
connected, right?
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful thing, actually. Like, I'm glad that you actually have emotion about it, because it means that you're like, that was not okay, right? The word like this, the ones that I find alarming, and again, we've done a lot of work, right? So the ones that I find the most alarming are the people that are telling me these stories like yours, right? And there's no emotion. That's actually where you're like, okay, this person is not connected to their story. They're not connected to themselves. So, in some ways, if we're still emotional about something, that is not necessarily meaning that it's still open or raw. But you and I have talked through, like, okay, how does that actually show up in your life? And it does, right? Like, there are things that do show up from it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I'm still getting emotional as you're talking about it. There's a couple things that you said in there because I used to view being emotional as a bad thing. So I love that you are affirming that I'm still emotional about this as a good thing. I don't know if you've
Hmm.
seen The Holiday when Cameron Diaz would try to make herself cry. That was
Yes.
me, literally to a T. And now I feel like I cry
Yes.
all of the time. I'm just
Uh
making up
huh.
for all of those lost years. But that was really affirming to hear that. So thank you for
Yes.
saying that because I used to feel
Yeah.
very juvenile because high school bullying just sounds like a juvenile thing that you deal with when you're wearing glasses and you have acne and you're just figuring out your life. So walking around as a 35-year-old woman and still being emotional about that, I used to feel embarrassed about it. But I feel like you
Right.
just sort of set me free from feeling embarrassed about it because you're right.
Right.
You and I have done the work where I don't disassociate any longer.
Mm-mm.
I can
No.
stay really present even when things are hard
Mhm.
And that's because of you, because my default was shut it down and run away.
Yes,
And
of
that is not
course.
good for anybody.
No.
And then
No.
the other thing that you said, um, I'm trying to remember because there was something that was so the hypervigilance piece.
Mhm.
If anybody out there is an audio and video, you'll probably have OCD after that because there's a million checklists and you want to make sure that you're always recording. But even before I got into podcasting, the audio and video space, there was always this level of hypervigilance
Yeah,
around me.
sure.
Just even if it's checking locks. Are you trustworthy? I am always aware of my surroundings.
Mhm.
But I don't know if I had tied it back to the bullying and how the authorities handled it afterwards, really
Mhm.
until I started doing this. And of course there's more things that have, caused some of that external behavior, but I do remember thinking after this incident in high school, I have no idea who to trust. And I
Mhm.
remember feeling scared. And I ended up switching high schools my senior year of high school. So I
Yeah.
had to drive 45 minutes to a different school. I had to basically start over with friends your senior year, which is hard. I couldn't play sports because if you transfer, you have to sit out a year. And so I
Mhm.
just felt like because of their injustice, my
Mhm.
entire life changed.
Yeah,
And that felt
absolutely.
so unfair.
Mhm.
And so
And
I
it
think,
was. It
yes,
was unfair, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is that really that should have never happened, right? Like nobody should be writing those things. You shouldn't be affected by it, and you certainly shouldn't have had to switch schools because of it, you know? You had to make a lot of adjustments in your life just to feel safe. That's not okay.
just to feel safe. That's And it's one of those things where when you're 16, you just kind of keep going and figure
Yeah,
it out. And then
totally.
it wasn't until, again, adulthood that I was like, I think I'm still holding on to some of these things.
Mhm.
So you had said something earlier about identifying why we're feeling that way. And then kind of, is that true? Was a question that you
Mhm.
asked in connection to, I'm not trusting this person. Is that true that I shouldn't?
Right.
What are some other things that we can do, whether it's high school bullying or other wounds from childhood, that we can start to heal so we can show up not as the people pleaser or the seeker of approval, but we can take back our own agency?
Right. Well, I think one thing, and you talked about it earlier, is not normalizing things that aren't normal, right? And whether that's high school bullying or a parent yelling all the time, or like some of these things. When you come into therapy, a lot of people are like, "Well, yeah, I mean, I was made fun of in high school, but who wasn't?" Right? Well, the reality is, there were people who weren't made fun of in high school, right? And while that is a teenage behavior, that's something we should be aware of, right? As parents, we should be aware of what our kids are doing, who they're friends with, how they're being, right? I mean, it's been normalized, but it's not okay, right? So
Yeah.
when we're thinking about these things, a lot of times what I notice is clients will come in and they'll start talking about their childhood, or start talking about, even when we were talking about bullying, right? That they're like, well, yeah, but this happened and this happened and this happened, but that's fine. This is just normal. It's just normal. It's just about being a kid. Right. And I'm thinking, no, it's not. It's not normal. you know, it might be the time of life where that could happen. Right. Like if we're talking about bullying, for example, middle school and high school is a big time where that can happen, but it's also not normal. Like it shouldn't be normalized as something that will happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So when we're thinking about that, even, I mean, let's just take bullying, for example. You know, and we've talked about this before too. When we think about bullying, bullying is a boundary violation, right? That's why you didn't feel safe, whether it's physical or emotional. It is a boundary violation. Okay. Even if you're writing on the walls of a bathroom, you're encroaching on somebody else's space. You're making them feel unsafe. Okay. And that is something we need to be aware of as humans. Okay. Sadly, bullying still happens, right? Like even into adulthood. I mean, you're well aware of the online world, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
you want to talk about bullying. That's one of the worst places it happens is online,
Which is
cyber, right?
crazy that it's in adults that are still finding a way
Hmm.
to spew angry, hurtful comments.
Right. Well, I think, when we're thinking about just this topic in particular, right? We're either on one of two sides. We're either the bully or we're being bullied.
Mm,
Okay. We're on one of two sides. And both of those sides have to do with boundaries, right? And also like how I view another person. Okay.
yeah.
And so, like for you, when you're being bullied, okay, you're actually having the experience that I'm not as good as somebody else,
Mm,
right? The experience is this person's up here and I'm here, right? I'm down here. And this person is actually like shaming me. They're making me feel bad. Okay. And so it's a value thing, right? It makes me
yeah.
feel less than. Okay. But it's also this person is up here and they're being boundaryless. They're not aware of themselves and they're impacting somebody else. They're violating another person's boundaries by entering into their emotional space, right? If physically, right? If we have a physical bully, that's really easy to see. And you called it little t, which is interesting, right? I break it up into overt and covert.
Ooh,
So
that's better.
overt, yeah, overt would be like a physical, like somebody beats you up at school. Okay. Like you see it, there's bruises, there's wounds, right? But to me, the covert stuff is that emotional piece, right? It could be the girls that turn their backs every time you walk into the room, right? Or the guys who are making ridiculous jokes and making someone feel, you know, low. Okay. Like those are the types of covert bullying that happens where we can't really see it, right? And as the person receiving it, you're like, well, I should be strong enough not to take that in.
That's
And the
what I always
reality
told
is,
myself.
yeah, kids aren't. Kids aren't strong enough to not like that, let them take that in. They are not. They're not supposed to, right? Children are supposed to be vulnerable. They're supposed to be able to feel like somebody's got their back, and that's why I said, like in this situation, your parents did have your back. Now, unfortunately, the authorities did not have your back, the people
They got
that
fired
should
the next
have.
year for other bad things that they had done.
Ah,
So it felt a little bit more
interesting.
justified that I wasn't really the only one. Yeah. Hey guys, Elizabeth here, popping in really quickly that if you are ready to set some goals for this upcoming 2025 year, let me tell you the exact resource that you need, and that's going to be your season planner. SZN Planner. It is not only cute and pretty and comes in some amazing colors that you're going to absolutely want to even use as maybe a coffee table book, but it will keep you on track on a daily and hourly basis to hit those goals. This planner has truly thought of it all, from motivation to keep you on track with your goals, while also keeping you really organized to make those dreams in your heart a reality. Season Planners was started by my girl, Georgia Stockton. She is a recent graduate of UGA, and we just love to support a young girly with a dream. And Georgia is kind enough to offer our listeners a 20% off discount for anybody that purchases a season planner. Just head to szn-planners.com. Go ahead and add one of those planners to your cart and then enter Elizabeth, Elizabeth, for 20% off your purchase. I'm telling you, you're going to want to take this planner with you everywhere you go because it's just so dang cute and also functional. Again, that is code Elizabeth at checkout for 20% off. Go chase those dreams. And now back to the episode. And to your point of
Right.
like the overt versus covert, I did always think, how can we fight back against people's words?
Right.
That's
Well,
hard.
as adults, right? As adults, that's a therapy thing, right? We've got to be able to help ourselves with our boundaries. Okay. So if I get a client, or, even through my own podcast, right? Like if I get a negative comment, okay, which doesn't actually happen very often, right? And there's that mindset of like you get 50 compliments and then you get one negative comment and you're like, oh my gosh, it's the worst thing ever, right? Like we wait for
Yeah.
that one negative thing to, totally define us. But But as adults, we want to be able to listen with boundaries, right? We never want to be walled off. Okay. Like you were talking about earlier, when we even like are talking about dreams, right? We never want to be opposed to having feedback.
Hmm.
Okay. Because somebody might go, "Oh, Elizabeth, that's really cool. And what do you think about this?" Right? If I'm walled off and I'm like, "No, don't mess with my dream." Okay. I might be missing out on something that could be really helpful.
Hmm.
Okay. But in the reverse, right, when somebody is verbally attacking us or emotionally attacking us, we've got to be boundaried enough to be able to say, "Ooh, that's about them and not about me." Okay. But as kids, we can't do that. I mean, you've heard the proverbial like sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. That is not true. It's
Let's set
not
the
true.
record straight. It's not true.
No, that is not true. Is not. As adults, yes, we can try to work toward that. Okay. Because we can have boundaries. But as kids, man, we are like little sponges and we're just taking everything in and absorbing everything. And we don't have the ability to say, that's about them, not about me. Right. I mean, it's just not possible. Okay. So as we're talking through this, the ways that we do that, I mean, there's several ways. I mean, one, like I said, like in adulthood, we have to work on our boundaries, our emotional boundaries. Okay. And if we're on the receiving end, okay, we want to be able to hold. I always put my hand out. And if you're listening to this, right, like you put your hand out and
And like
you
a
make a
stop.
little space in between your fingers, enough that you can let stuff through if you need to. But in general, it just hits your hand and it can fall down, right? So that, for 50 positive comments, if I have one negative comment, I can look at that and I can go, okay, all right, yep, I feel that. And you know what? What that one thing that she said, she's kind of right about that. Okay, so I can let that in and everything else doesn't get in. Okay. So on the receiving end, we are always constantly checking in on what am I taking in? Am I using healthy boundaries? Hmm.
What should we do if we're walking around with these words in our head of mean comments or mean things from high school, whether you've been there for 5 minutes or 5 years or 15 years? How
Right.
can we lessen that negative kind of subconscious or stream of conscious mindset?
Right.
How can we get
Well,
back to our own thoughts?
yeah. I think it's one of those things because when we're kids, right? Those negative comments can really come in and sit there. Okay. And what I will say in adulthood, if those comments are coming in at us and we're taking them in, it means they're just, it's almost like the original negative comment that we're thinking about is like a magnet,
Yes.
right? So we're always looking for confirmation and that's true, right?
Interesting.
So
Okay.
if the thought is I'm ugly, okay? If that's what I in my core, like that's what I think, I'm going to constantly look for feedback from people that validates that. Okay? So think about that, right? If that's the core belief, whatever it is, I'm stupid, I'm lazy, I'm ugly, I'm unlovable, whatever that is, we're constantly scanning the environment for that. Okay? There's that hypervigilance. Okay? So, what we've got to do is actually go back and reparent that younger part.
Yeah.
Okay. So, in your case, right? Like, I'm making it up, but it could be I'm in danger or I'm in or whatever, right? And so we actually want to go back when we're feeling that and actually let that little girl know, actually that's not true, right? Some people might have the idea that they're unlovable or unlikable or I don't belong, right? There's a lot of these core woundings that we have that do come from childhood, right? Whether that's because of our parents or whether that's because of school or whatever the environment was that we clung to that belief system, right? We've got to go back and actually reparent that part of us. Does that make sense?
Totally.
So,
I
yeah.
think something interesting, I'm sort of, it's interesting having a conversation with you about this versus like being in a counseling session because it's
Hmm.
almost categorizing like the different steps in my head. Because I think what's interesting, or it might be helpful for people too, is let's say that they're like they get really emotional, like their big emotions come up, let's say with rejection or a negative comment.
Mhm. Yeah.
In that moment, tell me if this is right or wrong, but I think it would be helpful for them to identify, what am I feeling? Why am I feeling so much in this moment?
Yeah.
What is that core belief that I'm telling myself in this heightened state?
Mhm.
How in this moment am I being hyper vigilant to then confirm this negative, not true belief?
Mhm.
What do I need to tell myself to reparent myself out of this moment and re-regulate?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that kind of the stepwise process in a
Yes.
perfect world?
Yes. 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 And to be honest, I was sitting here as you were talking through those steps and I thought, yeah, that's exactly it. And um I think it's interesting because I think about even things in my own life, right? Like if I'll get are you okay if I get vulnerable here for just a second?
Would love
Like,
it.
okay. So, one of my core beliefs is that this is gonna sound crazy, that I'm bad, right? Like and so I really try hard to be good all the time. And by good, I mean I don't want to upset anybody. I don't want to make anybody sad. I don't want to make anybody feel bad because at my core, what I'm fearing is that there's something wrong with me, right? That I am actually inherently bad. And so when I hurt somebody, it's because I'm bad. Does that make sense?
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So something happened just recently where I posted something. And again, lots of positive feedback, right? Lots of positive feedback. But one person wrote to me and said, "Hey, when I saw this, it made me feel this." And I know that might not have been your intent, but I just needed you to know. And so immediately, I mean, it takes zero point 0.4 seconds and I just feel it in my body. I'm like, oh gosh, there it is. Does that make sense? Okay. So, like, if I'm thinking about it, like from a bully perspective,
Yeah.
okay, like I almost overcorrect, like kind of like what you were talking about earlier, like because I actually was bullied in middle school, okay? Like I overcorrect and I'm going to make sure. And the ironic thing is I actually when I posted this thing, I actually thought of what this person addressed. Like, I actually was like, "Okay, somebody could say this, but here's how this is what I did to alleviate that." Right? And it still
It
happened,
still
right?
happened.
Okay. So immediately I'm like, "Oh my gosh, there it is. Whatever. I'm bad. See, I hurt somebody and I didn't mean to. And so that means that I am just bad." Right. And so in that moment, I really have to take that minute and go, okay, what is going on there? What makes me feel so bad about this one person's comment? Because it's not always as obvious as it seems, right? And so I have to take that minute and go, okay, oh, there that is, right? I feel like I'm a bad person because I hurt this person. Okay. So while I can make amends, right, I can go to this person and be like, oh my gosh, thank you so much for your feedback. I, here's how I tried to correct that, but I totally validate that what you're feeling is real, blah, blah, blah. Okay. But I also need to do that for myself, right? Like, honey, it is okay. You know what? You're not going to be perfect and it doesn't mean that you're bad, right? So I'm talking to that younger part of me that does feel bad about that. Does that make sense?
Do you mind if I ask you how old you feel when that emotion came up?
It's really young. It's like probably between 4 and 7.
Wow, it's young.
She's really little. Yeah. Yep. Really little.
Do you think that that is helpful in those moments to identify how old you feel when that kind of
Mhm.
emotion comes up?
Yes. Yes. Yep. And that's, when you're thinking about even what you're talking about too, when you're feeling unsafe, okay? That's an important part of that. It's going, okay, it could be for you like I am in the middle of Franklin, Tennessee, and I am on Main Street, and it's the middle of the day. Like, what is going on in me that I don't feel safe right now? Okay. It could be that you walked into this restaurant and I don't know anybody and I feel alone, right? So that might feel unsafe, right? Or whatever. Okay. But it is important to kind of go back to that younger part of you and let her know, honey, it is okay. It's all right. I've got your back. We're okay. I promise I'm going to keep you safe, right? And that's how we work with that. Does that make sense?
And is that what you would call the definition of reparenting? Is
Yes.
going back and identifying what age you feel when that emotion comes up and speaking to that version of you of what you needed in that moment, because that's still what you
Yes.
need in the present moment.
Yes. Yes. Because I guarantee you that most everybody, even that's listening to this, they do have a core wounding, whether it's like you, I'm not safe, or me, I'm bad, right? Like there is a core wounding there. And I would place money on it that like 98% of the time, that's what's showing up in the moment,
Yeah.
right? It's not that we're actually being bullied in real life, like right now. Okay. Yes, that can be hurtful, very hurtful. Okay. And I'm not even suggesting this person that commented on mine was bullying. She was absolutely not. Okay. But if we're talking about bullying, right? Like that can make you feel really unsafe in the moment. Okay. But I could almost guarantee you that anything that's coming up is going to be attached to something that's younger. Right. And that's how we build those boundaries as adults. That's why we do the reparenting, because it helps us build those boundaries so that, so that we are making adjustments and so that we're not so permeated by somebody else's boundaryless behavior, boundaryless actions, words, whatever you want to call it.
I don't know if you've said this or if I read this somewhere else online. I don't think I was smart enough to make it up in my own head, but it was something along the lines of, well, what happened to you was not your fault. Your healing is now your responsibility.
Yes. Yes.
And while it may not
Absolutely.
seem fair, that
Hmm.
does not only does it help you not continue that behavior towards other people, but
Hmm.
it also allows you such freedom in your life as well.
Yes.
Because you don't have to continue to feel bad all of the time and not know why.
Right.
Bringing it back to something you said at the beginning of the conversation with maybe more of like a tough love counselor that might say, just leave the relationship. But you were saying, why did you not have that internal knowing that maybe
Hmm.
you should leave, and asking those
Hmm.
types of questions? And
Hmm.
it's in small moments that might be bullying or a comment or something else that that core wounding can kind of come up. And to me, that makes sense of why we stay in relationships or why we stay in that friendship or why we don't make a change and we know that we should,
Right.
because it might not be necessarily obvious what that core wounding is. And I think
Hmm.
that too, identifying in a moment where you feel that heightened, whether it's scared or shame or embarrassment or I am bad, I think sometimes it can be hard to identify that in ourselves unless we know to look for it the next time it comes up.
Yes.
And so if
Yes.
people are not necessarily in therapy, but the next time somebody says something or you're doing something and I don't even know how to explain, but you just get that fire in your chest and you,
Mhm.
I think everybody probably knows it, that drop in your stomach feeling, and you don't feel necessarily in control of what your emotions are in that moment. Identify what it is that you're telling yourself, because that can be very
Yes.
revealing of your core wounding.
Yes.
And something else that you said, it makes me think of, I'd love to actually know your thoughts on this. The let them and let
Mhm.
me theory that Mel Robbins has been kind of putting
Mhm.
around
Yep.
what you were saying, in the sense of you validated that woman's comment. She wasn't bullying, but she didn't have a positive thing to say.
Yeah.
Let her feel that and say that. And
Yeah.
it didn't get through your fingers, kind of like your hand, like maybe the positive part did, but not the hurtful part.
Sure.
But then also let me, the reparenting part of, this does not mean that I am bad.
Yeah.
Is that an appropriate use of the let them, let me theory that's kind of going around on Instagram right now?
I think so. It's funny. It's on my reading list. It's like
Okay.
sitting in the
We'll
pile
read
of
it together.
books.
I haven't read it,
Yeah.
but I've listened to enough Mel Robbins podcasts that I feel like I
Yeah.
kind of understand the concept.
Yeah. Well, it goes along with like, I mean, again, it goes along with a lot of boundary setting because a lot of people struggle with boundaries because they don't want to disappoint somebody. And I'm like, well, let them be disappointed. It's fine,
Yes.
right? Like, let them feel their feelings. It's fine. Like, we don't need to stop people from feeling what they feel, right? We don't want to be jerks. We don't want to be offensive. We can be thoughtful with ourselves and we can be thoughtful with our words and our actions, right? But we are going to have to let other people feel things, right?
Yes.
We're going to have to let them be human. Okay.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, it is interesting when I think about that theory again. It's on my reading list. But it is, yeah, I mean, part of that, what I was talking about with that person, we can validate that actually her experience is real and true. She did feel like that was a real thing. She wasn't being offensive. She was just talking through it, right? But if I'm not adult, okay, so this is another thing, right? If I'm not in my adult headspace when I'm reading that, I could take it as something that is offensive to me,
Hmm.
right? And it's not always like that. Okay. Sometimes they could be very thoughtful on their end and being like, this really impacted me. And I can hold space for that. I can let that be true and let it be true that I'm not a bad person. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes.
And so those are both truths, right? We can let them have their feelings and I can have my feelings too, right? Both things can be true at the same time.
I think you've
Yeah.
unlocked a couple areas that women struggle with a ton, which I would say is people pleasing and the
Hmm.
overcorrection when we feel like we have disappointed someone.
Yep.
Um, I think the other aspect of people pleasing, or maybe it's more
Hmm.
adaptability. I think when we are told bullying is normalized, or this is just a part of growing up, or if somebody's just going to have a thought, you got to let
Hmm.
that be. I think each time we do that, we lessen that boundary, we lessen our gut instincts, we lessen the agency that we can take up. And to me, over time, you become an adult that doesn't know their needs, desires, likes, or dreams, or what they want to
Right.
do with their life. And I work with women often that
Hmm.
feel like that they don't know what they want to do. And so it's interesting when it comes to podcasting. Well, I don't know, it might just be like, oh, just start a podcast. It's easy to start. Podcasting is so personal that you have to know yourself and know what your beliefs are to really be able to get
Yeah.
on the mic each week, even to have conversations. And so it's starting to uncover for women that they don't actually super
Hmm.
know themselves. They have a lot of things to say, but they don't know themselves. And I think a lot of that is because it is based off of people or even our internal selves normalizing and becoming adaptable to a not ideal situation until we just adapt our personality
Yes.
away.
Yep. And
Do you
yes.
see that?
And I think adaptability it's one of those things where, yeah, I agree with you. It has become something that can be a positive thing, right? Like when
Mhm.
we can, again, I think the word that I come back to is agency, right? When we can choose it, okay, adaptability is okay, right? So if I'm in a group of people where I have to be in this group of people and I don't necessarily agree with everything they're saying, I can be adaptable to that situation, meaning I'm not, I can go into those things and still feel comfortable and safe, right? Because I've adapted myself internally to be able to do that. Okay. I'm not changing
Yes.
myself. I'm not agreeing with anything they're saying, but I can be with them in their difference of opinion and still feel internally like I'm me and I'm okay. Right. And that's true adaptability. Okay. When I'm changing myself, or all of a sudden I feel like I'm laughing at jokes I shouldn't be laughing at, or, participating in conversations that make me feel uncomfortable, that's not okay. Right. That is not adaptability. I'm changing who I am to fit in. Does that make sense? And so
Yes.
fitting in is very
Yes.
different than being internally adaptable, because that to me is more of a personal thing, right? That's how I feel in the room versus am I fitting in with this group? Okay.
Yes. It's adaptability versus abandoning
Yes.
yourself,
Yes. Yes.
maybe. And it's interesting as well because, my experience is so much in podcasting and encouraging women to get on the mic, but I have found that after an interview, if the host didn't feel like it went well, or vice versa, if I'm supporting the guest and they feel
Mhm.
like it didn't go well, they start
Mhm.
to spiral because they're thinking I didn't show up in the way that this other person
Yep.
wanted me to show up. So a lot of my work, while yes, it's telling you what mic to use and headphones to use, it's also after this
Mhm.
conversation, you might
Mhm.
spiral a little bit. Here's how you can have agency, no matter how the other person showed up, whether they showed up with no energy or maybe they were just giving one sentence answers. Here's how you can still leave and not think, this is all my fault. I'm bad at this. Because I think two things we can, overly take the blame. And then what happens is these women then just become a mirror more of their guest versus showing up as themselves and being the confident host to lead the conversation. But the reality is people are showing up to that podcast to listen to what the host has to say. And so I have seen women start to abandon themselves a little bit just to fit in. And while, yes, there is a level of social grace, we want to make sure that people feel comfortable around us. That is just kindness and compassion. But I've seen women completely abandon themselves to make sure a guest feels comfortable or because they felt dysregulated by the conversation. And so your work with me in counseling has also transferred into my work with my clients as well, because this stuff you don't get to choose when
No.
it shows up.
No, we really I always tell people like, "Will this mean that everything that I experience goes away?" I'm like, "No. Unfortunately not." Like, you're still gonna react in situations. It's just a matter of having the ability to decide when I wanna respond or not, right? Like, I can still feel what I feel, right? Like, I can still feel unsafe, or I can still feel like, "Oh, I feel that I'm bad," right? But I can have agency over if I wanna respond to that or not, right? And so, I think that's a lot of it. But I think to go back to your question about adaptability versus fitting in or abandoning self, we've got to know who we are, right? I mean, that is what it comes down to. If you don't know that, if you don't have a healthy core here, okay, it's going to be very difficult to do anything that involves other people without having that and being impacted, right? Especially something as big of a platform as podcasting, right? Like, because you're talking, I mean, sometimes when I'm getting these numbers in my head and I don't have that many listeners, but if I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh my gosh, that 5,000 people listen to that. Okay. I mean, if I were standing in front of 5,000 people, like, holy cow, or even 1,000 people, like,
That's
that's
terrifying.
terrifying, right? So some people think like, oh, podcasting, it's easy because you're just sitting in front of a mic. You're like, no, I'm actually not. Like, it's a big audience, right? So if you're talking about like people that are doing this as their profession or even as a hobby, right? Like, you do have to have a sense of who you are in order to be acting out of that, right? I often say, like,
Yes.
with my clients, and I'm sure I've said this before to you, but who we are when we turn on a faucet, right? Like, water always comes out. Okay. So if I'm doing my own podcast, if I'm on yours, if I'm on somebody else's, you're going to recognize me. Okay. You're going to recognize me. You're going to feel me. You're going to sense the same person. If you saw me in the counseling office, you would get a sense of me with my kids and my family, like with my friends. You're going to see a sense of me. Okay. The whole way through. Right now, if I'm on my podcast, right, I'm probably not going to curse. I'm probably not going to say certain things, right? Because my audience is particular to that, right? If I'm in a session, depending on who it is, I might not do that, right? So there's the faucet, right? I'm still me, right? But I'm probably going to be less, right? Because of who is sitting in front of me. Now, if you saw me with my best friend, right? You might be like, okay, she's coming out a little bit more, right? Like there's going to be more of me, but you're going to still recognize me. Does that make sense? I am not going to be a
Yeah.
different person than who you saw 5 minutes ago in the counseling office or who you listened to last week on this podcast. Still going to be the same essence, but there just might be a little more flavor.
To your point, I have would love to be invited to those best friend hangs. I have tried to be friends with Laura, and she sets very good counselor boundaries. And I may or may not have one time asked her, "Can I just come for a session at like 4:45? And if I have a bottle of wine and we talk for 60 minutes, is that still a counseling session?" She was
It's
like,
still a
"No, that's
session.
happy hour, Elizabeth. Do not do that. Do not show up to my office with wine to hang out." I do wish we could be real life
Oh,
friends. I think in another world we are. But I think
I
that's such
know.
a good point, because I don't think that there is an extreme in that, because one is
Mm-mm.
unkind and one is abandoning yourself. But finding that faucet example is
Yeah.
really, I think that's the in between. And I think that's a really good visual that people can hold on to
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
assess in different
Because,
situations.
yeah, because not everybody has the right to all of me, right? And for people that are listening, especially the people that you work with, right? Especially in the podcasting world, okay? Not everybody has a right to all the information, okay? And so, my deepest friendships are going to know more about me, right? Because they're my deepest friendships. Whereas the people that you know, might know me just on a more acquaintance level aren't going to know those deep, dark things because they don't have a right to that. And they're not going to hold that space like my best friends do. Right. And so there's another example of that faucet. Like, I'm still me, I'm still who I am, but but there's a little less water coming out when I'm sitting on a baseball field with people that I don't know. Right.
Totally.
Does that make sense?
Makes so
Yeah.
much sense. Thank you for sharing
Hmm.
that, because I think that that is a good, it just puts words to what people might be feeling. I think specifically women.
Yeah.
And it gives us a tool and a resource to think through when we're going through something like
Yeah.
that. When I did
Yeah.
put that poll on Instagram about bullying, people wrote in some crazy stories that they experienced. And it just broke my heart that at such a young age, some of these women were experiencing that. But
Hmm.
I did have a mom write in, and she said that her 11-year-old is experiencing some really bad bullying at school.
Yeah.
Do you have any
Mm-mm.
words for the mom on how to help their daughter?
Yeah. I mean, again, I mean, I'd say this is an encouragement. Well, I have two comments about this. One is for the mom whose child is being bullied at school. We as parents, we have the ability to keep things that could be traumatizing and keep them at a lesser level with our kids. Kids can't avoid trauma. Like we can't do that as parents. We can try as hard as we can, and sometimes things are going to happen, right? I mean, unfortunately, we have access to news all the time, right? And so we can see that a lot of times, like, we're not in control of all the things that can happen, right? And so, what I say to parents often is like, yeah, trauma's going to happen to your kids. It is, right? Like, bullying is going to happen, but we can actually keep it from being traumatizing by being accessible, by talking through feelings, by advocating, right? By getting them counseling if they need counseling. But it's really just in the presence of the parent, right? How accessible you are to your child.
Okay.
Okay. It's not going to make it go away, right? I mean, we can't control everybody else, but the thing we can do is be present for our kid,
Yeah.
right? That is the number one most impactful thing to a child is your presence as a
Mm,
parent. Okay. And a lot of people think, well, I'm here. No, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is regulated presence, right? So if you notice in your body as a parent that you're getting like all up in arms or you're getting nervous or anxious or whatever, you might actually need to go to counseling so that you can be present for your child.
that's
Okay.
good.
And so that's a number one is presence. Okay. Um, and to the parent that's parenting the child who's bullying, like, put boundaries on your kids. Okay. They're learning it from somewhere. All right. So think about what you're doing. If you're making jokes at home, if you're making fun of people, if you're judging other people, if you're doing anything like that, they're picking up on it. Okay. A lot of times parents are like, I don't know. We don't bully people at home. Well, if you're telling jokes about somebody, if you're making fun of people at home, you are bullying, and the you're setting the standard and the example that it's okay and it's not. Right. And so a lot of times when kids are doing that, they're experiencing it somewhere in their lives. And so to parents whose children are doing the bullying, get a grip on yourself, first of all, and then parent your children. It's not okay. It's not okay. It hurts people and it's not okay. And if they don't learn how to put boundaries on themselves now, they will continue doing it into adulthood.
That's so good. I'll be sure that I send this to the woman that wrote in about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we covered pretty much everything that I had written down, which is kind of a miracle because I usually never actually look at my notes when I'm doing these interviews. But I feel like I have been prepared for the last 5 years to have this conversation with you, just knowing you and being meeting so often and so
That's
well.
awesome.
But Laura, thank you for your words. I usually prep my guests with this, but because I did everything wrong with how I set up this schedule, because I just texted you, I didn't send you the scheduling link, I didn't send you anything ahead of time, and that is totally on me. This is a big learning lesson for me.
And look, we still made it. We're still here. We're okay.
But I love to ask my guests at the end, I'll maybe put it towards your dad, since it seems like you guys had some interesting conversations growing up.
Yeah.
Did he have a saying or a phrase that you just remember him with, that let's say you wrote it down on a napkin, that you would leave this phrase on a note for somebody else to read?
You're going to laugh.
Okay, good.
Because I say this to my best friend, Ashley, a lot. He always, when you like, and I think this is probably from the military, maybe, because he was in the military and he wanted to be a pilot. But he always said, "Checo, checo."
What does that mean?
When it means like, okay. So if Ashley says something to my best friend, if she says like, hey, we're meeting at 5:00 today, I'll say, "Checo, checo."
Oh my gosh, I love that. That is so sweet. Having those internal kind of dialogues and languages are so important. But Laura, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Thank you for being who you are to me in my life and to people that are tuning in today. You have a podcast. Where can people listen to your podcast and where can they find you online?
Yeah. It's called Encountering You, and you can find it anywhere. Apple Podcasts. You can find it on Access More. It's through K-Love, the radio station. And it's really great. We're a little bit on a pause right now because I've had some health issues, but we're on a little bit of a pause, but I'll be back in the next few weeks with some new episodes. But there's, a lot of episodes. There's probably 100 episodes on there already. So, so yeah, tune in. It's great stuff. It's, I always say it's very practical. It's very practical stuff. So, yeah, you're never going to leave with an empty hand. And I don't say that to toot my own horn, but it's really something that I feel is very important.
For sure. You don't give advice, but you do give tools. And I think that's what makes your work life-changing.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
And then is it at Laura Williams on Instagram?
It's at Laura Williams LPC.
LPC. Okay. Awesome.
Yep. Licensed professional counselor.
You're so professional.
There's a lot of Laura Williams out there. So couldn't be just at Laura
only one
Williams
in my world. So Laura, thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure I will be seeing you very soon.
Yes, I hope so. And thank you. Thank you for having hard conversations. Yeah. It's a good thing. And it's rare. So I think it's good. We need to be having hard conversations. So
thank you. Yeah.
Just love you.
Awesome. I'll see you soon.